She was trapped under fire, out of rounds, until a SEAL's rifle slid into her hands. The desert sun blazed overhead as Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a crumbling mud wall in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Her heart pounded against her chest as bullets whizzed past her head, sending chunks of dried clay flying in all directions. The enemy fighters had them pinned down in what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the village of Marja. Sarah's rifle felt heavy in her sweaty palms as she counted her remaining ammunition. 3 rounds left. Her squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, lay motionless 20 feet away, blood pooling beneath his still form. The medic, Private Johnson, was frantically trying to stop the bleeding from Corporal Wang's leg wound while staying low behind an overturned cart. The ambush had come from nowhere. One moment they were walking through the dusty streets checking on local families and distributing medical supplies. The next, the air erupted with the sharp crack of AK-47s and the whistle of RPGs. Sarah's team of 8 Marines had been caught in a deadly crossfire between 2 buildings, with Taliban fighters positioned on rooftops and behind windows. "Mitchell, how's your ammo?" shouted Private Davis from behind a burned-out car. "Almost dry," she called back, her voice barely audible over the constant gunfire. 3 left. The situation was getting worse by the minute. Their radio operator had taken shrapnel in the first few seconds of the fight, and their only working radio was damaged. No one knew they were in trouble. The nearest base was 15 miles away, and their scheduled check-in wasn't for another 2 hours. Sarah pressed her back against the wall and tried to control her breathing. In her 22 years of life, she had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this. Growing up in small-town Ohio, she had joined the Marines to serve her country and see the world. The daughter of a factory worker and a nurse, she had always been tough, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of combat. The enemy fire seemed to be coming from at least 6 different positions. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of their weapons, the rapid chatter of machine guns mixed with the slower, methodical shots from sniper rifles. Every time one of her teammates tried to move, bullets would rain down on their position. "We need to get out of here," whispered Johnson, the medic, as he finished bandaging Wang's leg. "These guys know exactly where we are, and we're sitting ducks." Sarah nodded, but she knew the truth. They were trapped. The open ground behind them offered no cover for at least 100 yards. Moving forward meant running directly into the enemy's strongest position, and staying put meant slowly running out of ammunition until they were completely defenseless. She took a deep breath and peered around the edge of the wall. A muzzle flash from a second-story window caught her attention. She raised her rifle, steadied her aim, and squeezed the trigger. The enemy fighter dropped from view. 2 rounds left. As the battle raged on, Sarah couldn't help but think about her family back home. Her mother would be getting ready for work at the hospital. Her little brother Tommy would be in school, probably daydreaming about football practice. Her father would be on the factory floor, checking his watch and counting down the hours until his shift ended. None of them had any idea that halfway around the world, their daughter and sister was fighting for her life. The sound of an explosion nearby made her duck instinctively. Debris rained down around them as smoke filled the air. When it cleared, she could see that the building next to them had taken a direct hit from an RPG. The wall they were hiding behind now had several large cracks running through it. "This position won't hold much longer," Davis called out, his voice tight with fear. Sarah checked her watch. They had been under fire for 37 minutes. It felt like hours. Her mouth was dry and her hands were beginning to shake from adrenaline and dehydration. The temperature had to be over 110 degrees, and the heavy body armor made everything worse. She fired her second-to-last round at movement in a doorway across the street. Miss. 1 round left. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In a few minutes, she would be completely out of ammunition. Around her, she could hear her teammates calling out their own dwindling ammo counts. They were all in the same desperate situation. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and said a silent prayer. When she opened them again, she saw something that made her heart sink even further. More enemy fighters were moving into position on the far side of the village. They weren't just going to wait for the Marines to run out of bullets. They were preparing for a final assault. The enemy fighters were moving with purpose now, and Sarah could see them coordinating their positions through hand signals. They had been patient, content to keep the Marines pinned down while they ran out of ammunition. Now they were preparing to finish the job. Movement on the left flank. Private Martinez whispered urgently from his position behind a pile of rubble. Looks like they're trying to surround us. Sarah's mind raced as she assessed their options. They could surrender, but everyone knew what happened to captured American soldiers in this part of Afghanistan. They could try to fight their way out with what little ammunition they had left, but that would be suicide. Or they could wait and hope for a miracle. She thought about her training at Paris Island, where her drill instructors had drilled into her the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis. Always faithful. Marines don't leave Marines behind. But what happened when all the Marines were trapped together? The wounded Corporal Wang was trying to sit up, despite Johnson's attempts to keep him down. "How bad is it?" he asked through gritted teeth. "You'll be fine," Johnson lied smoothly, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. The bandage on Wang's leg was already soaked through with blood, and they had no way to get him to proper medical care. Another burst of gunfire erupted from their right side, forcing everyone to press themselves against whatever cover they could find. Sarah felt pieces of concrete and mortar rain down on her helmet. The enemy was testing their defenses, looking for weak spots. "Sarah," called out Private Davis using her first name instead of her rank, which told her just how desperate their situation had become. "I've got 1 magazine left. What about you?" "1 round," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The silence that followed her words was deafening, even with the sounds of battle continuing around them. Everyone understood what that meant. Their most experienced marksman, the one who had been keeping the enemy's heads down, was about to become just another sitting duck. Sarah had always been the best shot in her unit. Back in training, she had earned expert marksman badges and had consistently outperformed soldiers who had been shooting since childhood. Her steady hands and keen eye had saved their lives more than once during their deployment. Now, with only 1 bullet left, that skill felt almost useless. She checked her watch again. 43 minutes since the ambush began. By now, someone back at the base might be wondering why they hadn't called in their scheduled radio check. But even if help was on the way, it would take time to organize a rescue mission and get to their location. Time they didn't have. The sound of footsteps on gravel made everyone freeze. Someone was moving closer to their position, trying to stay hidden behind the buildings. Sarah raised her rifle and aimed toward the sound, but she couldn't see the target clearly. She couldn't afford to waste her last bullet on a maybe. "Contact front," Martinez whispered, barely audible. 50 meters. Sarah saw him then, an enemy fighter creeping along the wall of a building, carrying what looked like an RPG. If he got close enough to use it, their small amount of cover would be blown apart in an instant. This was the shot she had to take. She steadied her breathing, just like she had been taught. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Find the target. Line up the sights. Squeeze, don't pull the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and she watched through her scope as the enemy fighter spun and fell. That was it. No more ammunition. Sarah's rifle was now just an expensive club. Around her, she could hear her teammates firing their own final rounds. The sharp cracks of M4 rifles became more and more sporadic as each Marine reached the end of their ammunition supply. Soon the only sounds would be the enemy weapons. "Anybody got anything left?" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice was weak, but he was alive. Sarah felt a surge of relief at hearing him speak. "Negative," came the responses from around their small perimeter. "Dry. Out. Nothing." Sarah set her empty rifle aside and pulled out her sidearm, a 9mm pistol with 15 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was something. Around her, she could see her teammates doing the same thing. Their rifles, the weapons they had depended on throughout their deployment, were now useless pieces of metal and plastic. The enemy seemed to sense that something had changed. The volume of incoming fire decreased, and Sarah could hear voices calling to each other in Dari and Pashto. They were probably coordinating their final assault, knowing that the Americans were no longer able to return effective fire. Sarah thought about home again, but this time the thoughts were different. Instead of worrying about her family receiving bad news, she found herself thinking about all the things she wished she had said. The letter she had been meaning to write to her high school teacher, who had encouraged her to join the military. The phone call to her grandmother she had kept putting off. The way she had argued with her mother before leaving for deployment over something stupid she couldn't even remember now. "Listen up," Sergeant Rodriguez called out, his voice gaining strength. "We're not going out like this. When they come, we make every shot count. We make them pay for every step. Sarah nodded along with the others. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than just sitting there waiting to die. She checked her pistol one more time, making sure a round was chambered and the safety was off. 15 bullets against an unknown number of enemy fighters. The math wasn't in their favor. The voices outside were getting closer now, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of multiple weapons being loaded and readied. The final assault was about to begin. In a few minutes, everything would be over. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she crouched behind the crumbling wall, pistol ready. The enemy had stopped shooting, which meant only one thing. They were preparing to move in close and finish what they had started. Sweat dripped into her eyes despite the bandana she wore under her helmet. The desert heat was brutal, but fear made everything worse. Her mouth felt like sandpaper, and she tried to remember when she had last taken a drink from her water bottle. Time seemed to move differently when you were about to die. Movement. 2 o'clock, whispered Private Davis, pointing toward a gap between two buildings. Sarah turned to look and saw shadows moving in the narrow alley. At least 3 figures, maybe more. They were being careful, but not careful enough. She could see the barrel of a rifle catching the sunlight as someone tried to get a better angle on the Marine's position. Sergeant Rodriguez was propped up against a broken concrete block. His face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still sharp. "When I give the word," he said quietly, "we all open up at once. Make them think we have more than we do." It was a good plan, Sarah thought. Their only chance was to make the enemy think twice about rushing their position. If they could create enough confusion, maybe they could buy some time. Time for what, she wasn't sure, but anything was better than giving up. The sound of boots on gravel was getting closer. Sarah counted at least 4 different sets of footsteps coming from multiple directions. The enemy fighters had spread out to attack from different angles, just like they had been trained to do. These weren't random fighters. They were organized and experienced. "Steady," Rodriguez whispered. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger of her pistol. She had chosen her first target, the fighter who was closest to their position, about 30 feet away behind an old oil drum. The distance was manageable for a pistol shot, but she would have to make it count. There wouldn't be time for second chances. A piece of metal clanged against stone somewhere to their left. Someone had accidentally kicked something, or maybe it was intentional. A distraction. Either way, it meant the attack was about to begin. "Now," Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible. Sarah and her teammates opened fire simultaneously. The sound of their pistols was sharp and echoing in the narrow streets. She saw her first target stumble and fall behind the oil drum. One down, but how many more were there? The enemy fighters responded immediately, but they seemed surprised by the volume of fire coming from the Marine's position. For a few precious seconds, they took cover instead of advancing. Sarah used the time to line up another shot. A fighter appeared in the window of a building to her right, aiming an AK-47 in her direction. Sarah swung her pistol toward him and fired twice. The first shot hit the window frame, sending concrete chips flying. The second shot found its mark and the fighter disappeared from view. But their small victory didn't last long. The enemy quickly realized that the Americans were using pistols now, which meant they were almost out of options. The incoming fire resumed with renewed intensity, and Sarah could hear voices shouting commands in the local language. "They're moving up," Martinez called out from his position. "Left side, multiple targets." Sarah could see them now. At least 6 fighters moving from building to building, using cover effectively as they got closer to the Marine's position. They were only about 50 yards away now and closing fast. She fired 3 more shots at the advancing figures, but the range was too far for accurate pistol work. The bullets kicked up dust around the enemy fighters, but she couldn't tell if she had hit anyone. "I'm out," called Private Johnson, dropping his empty pistol. Sarah checked her own ammunition. 7 rounds left. Around her, she could hear similar counts from her teammates. They had maybe 30 seconds of fighting left before they were completely defenseless. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the middle of a firefight. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of battle, but growing stronger. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors in the distance. "Do you hear that?" Davis asked, his voice filled with sudden hope. Everyone stopped shooting for a moment to listen. There it was again, definitely getting closer. But Sarah's heart sank as she realized the truth. Even if help was coming, it would take several minutes for helicopters to reach their position and assess the situation. They didn't have several minutes. The enemy fighters seemed to hear the helicopters too because their attack became more urgent. They were trying to finish off the Marines before any rescue could arrive. Sarah saw two fighters break cover and run toward their position, firing as they moved. She aimed carefully and fired twice. The first fighter stumbled but kept coming. The second shot dropped him completely. The other fighter made it to within 20 feet of their position before Davis managed to hit him with his pistol. 5 rounds left for Sarah. The helicopters sounded closer now, but still not close enough. "They're coming from behind," Martinez shouted urgently. Sarah spun around to see 3 enemy fighters climbing over the rubble of a collapsed building that was supposed to be protecting their rear. They had found a way to flank the Marines' position, and now they were trapped in a crossfire. She fired her remaining 5 shots as fast as she could aim, trying to keep the flanking fighters from getting close enough to use grenades. She hit at least one of them, but the others kept coming. The click of her empty pistol was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Around her, she could hear the same sound from her teammates' weapons. They were completely out of ammunition now, and the enemy knew it. Sarah grabbed a loose piece of concrete, preparing to fight with whatever she could find. This was it. After everything they had been through, after all their training and preparation, they were going to die in this dusty village thousands of miles from home. The enemy fighters were moving in for the final assault when something unexpected happened. A rifle came sliding across the ground, spinning to a stop right in front of Sarah's position. Sarah stared at the rifle for a split second that felt like an eternity. It was an M4 carbine, exactly like the one she had been carrying, but this one had a full magazine. She could tell by the weight when she grabbed it and the small piece of tape on the stock that marked it as belonging to a SEAL unit. Without thinking, she rolled to her left and came up firing. The muscle memory kicked in immediately. The familiar weight of the rifle, the way it settled into her shoulder, the sight picture through the optics. Her first shot took down the closest enemy fighter, who was less than 15 feet away. "Where did that come from?" Davis shouted over the renewed gunfire. Sarah didn't have time to answer. She was too busy trying to save their lives. The rifle felt like a gift from heaven, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. She had to make every shot count, just like she always had. Moving with the precision that had made her the best marksman in her unit, Sarah engaged the enemy fighters who had been closing in for the kill. Her shots were quick and accurate, dropping 2 more fighters before they could react to this sudden change in the battle. The helicopters were definitely closer now. She could see dust being kicked up in the distance by their rotor wash. But the enemy fighters weren't giving up. If anything, they seemed more desperate, knowing that American reinforcements were on the way. A new voice cut through the chaos, someone speaking English with a slight southern accent. "Marines, stay low. We've got your 6. Sarah glanced back and saw 3 figures in different camouflage moving with the fluid precision of Special Operations Forces. They were firing as they moved, their weapons disciplined perfect as they engaged the enemy fighters who had been trying to flank the Marines' position. One of them, a tall man with a thick black beard, caught Sarah's eye and pointed to the rifle in her hands. He gave her a thumbs up and then immediately turned back to the fight. That explained where the rifle had come from. "Navy SEALs," Rodriguez called out, his voice stronger now that hope had returned. "Don't know how they got here, but I'm not complaining." The arrival of the SEALs changed everything. The enemy fighters, who had been confident they were about to overrun a small group of trapped Marines, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 groups of highly trained American soldiers. The hunters had become the hunted. Sarah used the confusion to move to a better firing position. She low-crawled behind a pile of bricks and set up with a clear field of fire toward the buildings where most of the enemy fire was coming from. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes in windows and doorways. Her first shot silenced a machine gun position on the 2nd floor of a building across the street. The gunner had been raking their position for the past hour, and taking him out felt like personal revenge. Her second shot dropped a fighter who was trying to throw a grenade at the SEAL team. The SEALs were working with military precision. They communicated with hand signals and moved like they had been fighting together for years. Sarah watched as they systematically eliminated the enemy fighters who had seemed so threatening just moments before. "Overwatch, this is ground team," one of the SEALs spoke into his radio. "We have 7 Marines, 2 wounded, need immediate casevac and close air support to secure the LZ." Sarah continued firing, picking her targets carefully. The SEAL's rifle, had what felt like a full 30-round magazine, but she couldn't afford to waste ammunition. Old habits died hard, and she found herself counting every shot just like she had been doing all day. The sound of helicopters was much louder now. Sarah looked up and saw 2 Blackhawks approaching fast, flying in formation. Behind them, she could make out the distinctive outline of an Apache attack helicopter providing escort. "This is Dustoff 7-2, a voice crackled over one of the SEAL's radios. "We have eyes on your position, marking enemy targets for engagement." What happened next was like something out of an action movie, except it was terrifyingly real. The Apache opened up with its 30mm chain gun, systematically destroying the buildings where enemy fighters were positioned. The sound was incredible, a deep, rattling roar that seemed to shake the ground. Sarah watched through her scope as enemy fighters began retreating from their positions, running for vehicles parked at the edge of the village. She lined up a shot on one of them, a fighter carrying what looked like an RPG launcher. The shot was over 200 yards, at the edge of her effective range with the rifle. She controlled her breathing, just like she had been taught. The crosshairs settled on the running figure. "Squeeze, don't pull." The rifle kicked against her shoulder and she watched the enemy fighter stumble and fall. The RPG launcher skittered across the ground, no longer a threat. "Nice shot, Marine," called out one of the SEALs, who had been watching through his own scope. "That's some serious marksmanship." The battle was winding down now. The Apache had eliminated most of the enemy positions, and the surviving fighters were either retreating or surrendering. The Blackhawks were circling, looking for a safe place to land and evacuate the wounded. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger was over, and she realized she was completely exhausted. The adrenaline that had been keeping her going for the past hour was starting to wear off. "Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez called out, "You okay?" "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. She felt like she had been running a marathon while solving math problems and juggling fire. Everything hurt, and her mouth still felt like sandpaper. One of the SEALs jogged over to her position. Up close, she could see he was older than she had first thought, probably in his 30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of combat experience. "That was some fine shooting," he said, offering her a bottle of water. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Williams. That's my rifle you're holding." Sarah handed the weapon back to him carefully. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved our lives." Williams shook his head. "You saved your own lives. We just helped even the odds a little." He looked around at the Marine positions, taking in the evidence of their desperate fight. "How long were you pinned down?" "About an hour," Sarah replied. "We ran out of ammunition right before your rifle showed up." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "We heard the firefight on the radio and came to investigate. Got here just in time to see you making your last stand." He paused, studying her face. "You ever think about joining the teams?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Join the SEALs? She had never even considered it a possibility. Women weren't allowed in SEAL teams, and besides, she was just a regular Marine who happened to be good with a rifle. "I don't think that's possible." "Chief," she said, accepting another sip of water from the bottle he offered. Williams smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something she didn't. "Times are changing, Marine, sooner than you might think." He gestured toward the battlefield where she had just been fighting. "What I saw today wasn't just good marksmanship. That was combat intelligence under pressure. You made decisions that kept your team alive." Before Sarah could respond, one of the Blackhawks touched down in a swirl of dust and debris. Medics immediately jumped out and ran toward their position, carrying stretchers and medical equipment. The sight of them made Sarah realize just how close they had all come to not making it home. The next several minutes were a blur of activity. Corporal Wang and Sergeant Rodriguez were loaded onto stretchers and carried to the helicopter. The medics checked over the rest of the team, treating minor wounds and checking for signs of shock or concussion. Sarah watched it all happen with a strange sense of detachment. She felt like she was watching a movie about someone else's life. The intense focus that had kept her alive during the firefight was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the kind of emotional numbness that followed extreme stress. "You're going to need to give a full debrief when we get back to base." Chief Williams told her as they waited for their turn to board the helicopter. "What happened here today is going to generate a lot of reports." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't looking forward to reliving the experience in a room full of officers asking detailed questions. She just wanted to call her family and let them know she was okay, then sleep for about 12 hours straight. The helicopter ride back to base was loud and uncomfortable, but Sarah had never been happier to be anywhere in her life. Through the small windows, she could see the Afghan landscape passing below, the same harsh, beautiful terrain that had almost become her grave. Sergeant Rodriguez was conscious and talking to the medics, which was a good sign. Corporal Wang was sedated but stable. Private Johnson sat across from her, staring out the window with the same shell-shocked expression she probably had on her own face. When they landed at Forward Operating Base Shank, there were more medics waiting, along with several officers who wanted immediate reports on what had happened. Sarah was separated from her teammates and taken to a debriefing room where she spent the next 3 hours recounting every detail of the ambush and firefight. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in her observations about the enemy fighters, how many there were, how they were armed, how they communicated, and how they coordinated their attack. Sarah answered as best she could, but honestly, most of her attention during the fight had been focused on staying alive rather than gathering intelligence. It wasn't until she was finally released from the debriefing that she learned the full story of how the SEALs had found them. Chief Williams and his team had been conducting their own mission in the area when they heard the firefight over the radio. They had immediately abandoned their original objective and moved to assist, arriving just as the Marines were making their final stand. "You were lucky," the base commander told her during a brief meeting in his office. "If that SEAL team hadn't been in the area, we might not have known you were in trouble until it was too late." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that luck was only part of it. They had survived because they had fought smart and never given up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The SEAL's rifle had been the turning point, but it wouldn't have mattered if she and her teammates hadn't been ready to use it. That evening, she finally got the chance to call home. The connection was scratchy and had a delay that made conversation difficult, but hearing her mother's voice was the best thing that had happened to her in weeks. "We saw on the news that there was fighting in your area," her mother said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've been worried sick." "I'm okay, Mom," Sarah replied, though she knew that okay was a relative term. She was alive and uninjured, which made her better off than she had any right to be. Her little brother Tommy got on the phone, full of questions about helicopters and guns and whether she had really been in a real battle like in the movies. Sarah did her best to answer without scaring him or giving him nightmares. Her father was last, and his conversation was the hardest. He had served in Vietnam and knew exactly what she wasn't telling them about what had happened. "You take care of yourself over there," he said simply, "and remember that we're proud of you no matter what." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her bunk and tried to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from routine patrol to desperate firefight, to unlikely rescue to media attention. Her commanding officer had already told her that she was being recommended for a Bronze Star medal, and there was talk of other recognition as well. But more than the medals or the recognition, what stuck with her was Chief Williams' question about joining the SEALs. She had dismissed it at the time, but now she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had always known she was good at her job, but today had shown her something else. She was good under pressure in ways that went beyond just marksmanship. Over the next few days, as she recovered from the physical and emotional stress of the firefight, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about what came next. Her deployment would be ending in a few months, and she had decisions to make about her future. She could re-enlist and continue as a regular Marine, or she could explore other options. Chief Williams visited her at the base hospital where she was being kept for observation. He brought news about her teammates. Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Wang were both going to make full recoveries, and an interesting proposition. "I've been talking to some people," he said, settling into a chair beside her bed. "There are changes coming to the special operations community. New opportunities that didn't exist before. If you're interested, there might be a path forward." Sarah looked at him carefully. "What kind of path?" Williams smiled, that same knowing smile. "The kind that starts with you proving you're as good as I think you are." 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing on the beach at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in San Diego. watching the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. The warm California morning was a far cry from the harsh desert of Afghanistan, but the memories of that firefight were still fresh in her mind. She had taken Chief Williams up on his offer, though it hadn't been an easy decision. Leaving the Marine Corps meant leaving behind everything familiar, her unit, her friends, her identity as a Marine. But the opportunity to join an elite special operations unit was too rare to pass up. The selection process had been unlike anything she had ever experienced. Months of physical training, psychological evaluation, and skills testing that pushed her to limits she didn't know she had. There were days when she wanted to quit, when the instructors seemed determined to break her down, when the other candidates, all male, looked at her like she didn't belong. But every time she was tempted to give up, she remembered that moment when Chief Williams's rifle slid across the dusty ground into her hands. She remembered the weight of it, the way it had felt like salvation, the responsibility that came with being the person others counted on when everything went wrong. Now, as she stood with the other graduates of the selection course, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. The scared young woman who had crouched behind a crumbling wall in Afghanistan was gone, replaced by someone harder, more confident, and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. Chief Williams approached the group, now wearing the insignia of a Master Chief Petty Officer. The promotion had come through just weeks after the Afghanistan mission, along with his own commendation for the rescue operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, though Sarah was still the only woman in the group, "welcome to the Naval Special Warfare community. You've earned your place here through months of hard work and dedication. But remember, earning your spot is just the beginning. Now the real work starts." Sarah smiled as she listened to his words. She had heard similar speeches before, but this one felt different. This one was about becoming part of something larger than herself, about taking on responsibilities that went beyond normal military service. After the ceremony, Williams pulled her aside for a private conversation. They walked along the beach, away from the crowds of family members and fellow graduates. "How does it feel?" he asked, gesturing toward the trident pin she now wore on her uniform. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Sarah replied honestly, "though I never would have imagined it a year ago." Williams nodded. "That's the thing about combat. It has a way of showing you who you really are. Not who you think you are or who other people think you are, but who you actually are when everything is on the line." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the waves roll in from the Pacific. Sarah thought about her family back in Ohio, who were still trying to understand her decision to leave the Marines for this new path. Her mother worried constantly. Her father was proud but concerned, and Tommy thought it was the coolest thing ever. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," Williams said eventually. "Your performance during selection was exceptional. But more than that, your story has gotten attention at the highest levels of the command. They want to use your experience as an example of what's possible in the new military." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Integration," Williams replied simply. "For decades, women have been excluded from certain roles in special operations. That's changing, and your story, a Marine who proved herself under fire and then successfully completed our selection process, represents something important." Sarah considered this carefully. She had never wanted to be a symbol or a poster child for anything. She just wanted to serve her country to the best of her ability. But she understood that her path had been unique, and if it helped open doors for other women, that was something worth supporting. "What would that involve?" she asked. "Speaking engagements, interviews, maybe some recruiting events. Nothing that would interfere with your operational duties, but visible enough to show that the old barriers are coming down." Sarah nodded slowly. "I can do that, as long as it helps the mission." Williams smiled. "I knew you'd see it that way." They turned and began walking back toward the base. Sarah could see her family in the distance, waiting for her by the parking lot. Her parents had flown out for the graduation ceremony, along with Tommy, who was now a senior in high school and considering his own military service. "Master Chief?" Sarah said as they approached the group. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That day in Afghanistan when you slid your rifle to me, did you know I would be able to use it effectively?" Williams paused, considering the question. "Honestly, I had no idea. I just knew that your team was about to be overrun, and giving you a weapon was better than letting you fight with rocks." He looked at her seriously. "But watching how you handled yourself after that, How you used the rifle to turn the tide of that fight. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are as a warrior." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Coming from someone with William's experience and reputation, that kind of recognition meant everything. Her family approached, and Sarah could see the pride in their faces mixed with concern about what her new role would mean. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering congratulations in her ear. Her father shook her hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed respect between warriors. Tommy, now 17 and nearly as tall as she was, grinned widely. "So you're like a Navy SEAL now?" he asked excitedly. "Something like that," Sarah replied, ruffling his hair like she used to when they were kids. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. It had started with a routine patrol in a dusty Afghan village, and had led her to one of the most elite units in the American military. The scared young Marine who had counted her last bullets behind a crumbling wall seemed like a different person now. But in many ways, she was still the same person, someone who refused to give up when things got difficult, someone who could stay calm under pressure, someone who understood that serving others was more important than serving yourself. That evening, at the graduation dinner with her family, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she checked it, she saw it was from one of her old Marine teammates, Private Johnson, the medic who had been with them during the ambush. "Saw the news about your graduation," the message read. "Always knew you were destined for something special. Thanks for keeping us alive long enough to find out what that was." Sarah smiled and showed the message to her family. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin and her father nodded approvingly. "That's the highest compliment a soldier can receive," he said quietly. "Being remembered as someone who brought people home." Later that night, as Sarah stood on the balcony of her hotel room looking out at the Pacific Ocean, she thought about the future. There would be new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to prove herself, but she was ready for all of it. She thought about Chief Williams's rifle sliding across that dusty ground in Afghanistan, and how it had changed the course of not just that one battle, but her entire life. Sometimes the most important moments happened in seconds, when you had to make decisions without knowing how they would turn out. Sarah had learned to trust those moments, to trust herself when everything was on the line. It had served her well so far, and she had a feeling it would continue to serve her in whatever came next. The next morning, she would report to her new unit and begin the next chapter of her military career. But tonight, she was content to stand in the California breeze and remember how far she had come from that scared young Marine counting her last bullets in a forgotten village on the other side of the world. She was exactly where she belonged.